This is Owen Gaines, aka Q-Tip from QTipPoker.com. This is Poker's Postflop Course Part 1, The River, Episode 2. We go over pages 46 to 68. Again, this isn't teaching the topic in detail, but touching on the points that are covered on these pages to facilitate discussion about both river play and any questions or comments you may have in the book. Again, we're still in the check or bet in position section, and in episode 1 we talked about, do I have a profitable value bet? What size is most profitable? In this episode we're going over, do I have a profitable bluff, and what size is most profitable? But again, as a base, we talk about checking. It's the last option, conceding no other decision has more value, and the EV of checking is the pot times our equity. We use checking as a base to analyze other options. And the reason we review that is because a profitable bluff I define as a bluff with a higher EV than checking. The equation for the EV of a bluff is the opponent's fold percentage times the size of the pot plus the opponent's call percentage times our bluff size as a loss. And just like with value betting, we have an evaluative EV and a true EV that I use in the book. Evaluative EV compares one option to another, and in this case checking and bluffing, and then true EV tells us how much richer or poorer will I be. So we could say the true EV of a bluff is $10, but again, who cares? What we want to know when we're check 2 in the river on position is a $10 bluff better than checking. So the EEV of a bluff we look at is the requisite folding percentage based on sizing compared to the percentage of the better hands in villain's range that he folds. So this table is found in most of my books, and it's the risk-reward ratio at work, and we're in the considering bluffing calling right now. And this is where if we bluff at a pot, we use a pot size bet. So say the pot's $100, we bluff $100, we're risking X to win X. The opponent must fold at least 50% of his better hands. And I want to emphasize better hands. We don't care if the opponent folds hands that are worse than ours. We don't gain any value there, because we could simply check and win our equity that way. So he has to fold at least 50% of his better hands, and we can go on down the line here or up the table as well. So half pot bet, he needs to fold at least 33% of his better hands, etc. And truncation does apply to the EEV equation the same way we did it for value betting. And in other words, if you make a evaluative EV equation for bluffing and you come up with some number, that may not be the true EV of bluffing. So if you wanted to figure out what the true EV of bluffing at that point, you'd have to find out what percentage of villain's range is better hands and multiply your EEV equation by that percentage. And here's a chart for bluffing into a $100 pot. And you'll look at the different bluff sizes, and you'll see, for example, this kind of red line is bluffing pot size bet, so we're bluffing $100, and it crosses the 0 EV line. This is assuming that we hold, I guess, the nut low, really. We see that it crosses the 0 EV line when the opponent folds 50% of his better hands. I guess this is a percent of his entire range. We'll be talking about the nut low, which is fine to start with. And then if we look at, say, a half pot bet, kind of this turquoise, that's going to cross that 0 line at 33%. So this is when we have a profitable bluff. Bluffing is more plus EV than checking. And there's a couple things we can note when we look at this graph. First of all, we see that they all come to a head and stop at this $100 line. So let's take a look at the value bet graph that we looked at in episode 1. This was for value betting. You see it fans out at both sides of this 50%, which was the definition for value bet, the opponent calling with at least more worse hands than better hands. And then here with bluffing, it's only fanning out at the left side. And so the first thing we can note, just comparing these graphs, is that the EV of a bluff is limited to the size of the pot. These lines here, they keep shooting up. The more, the larger we bet, the higher these lines are just going to go when the opponent is calling with all worse hands. Now, whereas with bluffing, if the opponent, whatever bluff size we make, the opponent folds, we can't get any better than the opponent folding 100% of his range. So our EV is capped at the size of the pot, which in this case is $100. And this point becomes important when we begin to compare a profitable bluff with a profitable value bet, which we'll touch on in episode 3. And the second thing we can look at is when the opponent folds a large percent of his range, you can't make a big mistake in your bluff sizing. And so when we look at the big mistakes to be made with value betting, we see there are large differences in EVs on both the left and right hand side. And we went over those potential mistakes in episode 1. Well, here, and when we talk about bluffing, we don't have that fan here on the right hand side. So when the opponent is folding a large percent of his range, and you can look from say 90 to 100, the EVs are really quite close. And so a large mistake can't be made when our opponent is folding a large percent of his range. And having said that, you can see in this graph that the smallest bet always has the highest EV, of course, until we get to where he's folding 100% of his range. But the actual size of a mistake in our bet sizing is virtually meaningless at those high percentage foldings for the villain. And so now we'll talk about what bluff size is best. So we have a profitable bluff. We want to find out which size is best. And the same way we talked about most opponents having an elastic calling range based on our bet size. Typically, the larger we bet, the more an opponent folds. His calling range gets smaller. And that's typically true. We talked about some exceptions. And the same is true with bluffing. When we don't simply try to make the opponent fold as often as possible, nor do we merely bet enough to get the job done. We always look to maximize the EV of our wager. So we're going to look at a particular bet size, look at the EV, increase it, look at the EV, and continue at that point until we find out which one has the highest EV, and that's the option we choose. So if we look at some bluff sizes, and this is in a $100 pot, and we look at some different bluff sizes, to produce an EV of $20, how often must the opponent fold in order to create an EV of $20? And then I've graphed this out here on the right, and we can watch this type of flattening effect, which again points towards a shrinking in the increase of necessary fold equity as our size gets larger. And this points to the power of small percentages, which is a recurring theme in poker decisions. Many times we'd say, well, what if this happens, what if that happens? Well, when you're looking at EV calculations, if you have a small percentage inside of a particular action, that action plays a small role in the actual outcome of the decision. So in this case, when the opponent calls rarely, whatever's inside of this parentheses, which is our bluff size, is going to have a small impact on the sum of the equation. So when this percent is 1% or 2%, then the actual bluff size inside of here creates a really small number that we subtract from the portion that we gain from his fold percentage. So if we look at two scenarios, scenario A and scenario B, here we bet $100 into a $50 pot, so we bet 2 times the pot. The opponent folds 90% of his range, and then we bet $1,000 into that same $50 pot. The opponent folds 98% of his range, so we've increased our fold equity by 8% by betting 20 times the pot instead of only 2 times the pot. And the difference between the EVs of these two scenarios is only $6, so we can see the impact here of the small percentages. In these tables, I spend a number of pages in the book going over these tables, and it's not information that we commit to memory. This I lay out to show how we can decide quickly without doing much math or perhaps any math to decide what would be better, a small bet or a large bet. And I won't go into these tables in detail here in this video, but an example that I give in the book is a pot is $60. We bet $30. The opponent folds 50% of his better hands. Are we better off bluffing $60? How would we know when a $60 bluff is better than a $30 bluff? And when we use these tables, we can find out the opponent folds an extra. If the opponent folds an extra 13% or more of his better hands, when we increase our bluff size to 60, then we can know that the $60 bluff is better. So I give a handful of those in the book. And then I move on to talk about different range shapes. We lay out some assumptions for how an opponent might respond with these range shapes and talk about how we need to act in order to get the maximum EV for our bluffs against these range shapes. And you'll notice that a polarized range is missing, and I talk about how those ranges perform much like our opponent holds a strong range. And then in the book I go over, I think, 3 different hands where I break down folding combinations, calling combinations, and give the EV for bluffing so we can decide which bluff size is better. And then you'll have an opportunity to do those in the book yourself. And that'll take you through to page 68. At the tail end of this section, there's a EEV shortcut for bluffing. You'll be able to find out what that number is in your head without using pen and paper or any software, which is really handy. There are 14 test your comprehension questions and answers, and then there are 9 exercises over the material, and there's about 27 questions and answers inside those exercises. It's quite a bit fewer than the number of questions and answers in the exercises in the first section, but these are time-consuming exercises, and you'll be given a table with, say, 3 or 4 different bet sizes and with calling ranges and folding ranges, and you have to fill in what those combinations are for each, and then calculate the EV of the different sizes to determine which is best, so you can figure out if you're able to perform that type of analysis. In episode 3, we're going to compare a value bet and a bluff. So what we've done in episode 1 was compare a value bet to checking. Here we're comparing a bluff to checking. And then episode 3, we're going to look at the value bet and a bluff. And we'll find out bluffing is not an alternative we consider after we determine we do not have a profitable value bet. Now, we can have a profitable value bet but still have a more profitable bluff, and vice versa. So look forward to seeing you in episode 3. Any questions, hit me up in the forums. Thanks for watching.